Hey there, sleepless rabble. Come closer. Let me take over for a while. Tonight, I'll take you somewhere strange. Back to the Middle Ages. A time where normal was anything but. We're talking pig trials, exorcisms via cabbage, and wedding night rituals that make you wish you'd stayed single. Yes, it gets weirder. No, we're not making this up. If you're into this kind of slow burning, slightly unhinged storytelling, help us grow. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. And here's your question. What's a tradition in your country that feels completely bizarre to you? We want to know. Seriously. You can also help keep this rebel project alive over at ko-fi.com/napmax. Every tip buys us more ambrosia, or cat treats, or therapy. Hard to say, really. Now get comfy. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to the craziest customs from the Middle Ages. You won't believe they were real. Let's begin with a yellow favorite: urine. In the Middle Ages, your pee was more important than your personality. Physicians, and I use that word very loosely, would ask you to bring them a small glass vial of your latest tinkle. Ideally warm, ideally fresh, ideally... Oh. Then they'd hold it up to the light, sniff it, swirl it gently, and sometimes, they'd taste it. Yes, taste, because colour wasn't enough. Texture, scent, and even the ring it made when you shook it were considered vital diagnostic clues. They'd compare your urine to stars, elements, moods, and biblical references. Dark yellow? Too much bile. Cloudy? Demonic influence. Bubbly? You probably offended Saturn. And if your doctor was extra mystical, he'd consult the urine wheel, an actual medieval diagram that matched pee colours to illnesses. There were 20 different shades. So if you had a fever, blame your bladder. A headache? Try peeing on some herbs and observing what they do. A broken leg? Still pee. To be fair, it was the one bodily fluid everyone could provide without screaming. But it was also completely ridiculously useless. Still, for centuries, the urine test was the gold standard of medieval medicine. You might even say it was liquid gold. Shall we move on? Good. Because the next bit involves knives. Imagine this. You wake up feeling a bit off. Maybe a headache, maybe some bloating, maybe life. Your local healer looks you over and says, well, you got too much blood, let's fix that. And by fix, he means drain it out of you. Bloodletting was the go-to solution for nearly everything. It didn't matter what your actual symptoms were: fatigue, fever, gout, melancholy, excessive joy. They'd blame it on an imbalance of your humours. And the worst of these, apparently, was too much life juice. So they'd bring out their trusty blade or their box of leashes. You'd lie there like a sad sack of meat, and someone would open a vein, usually the arm, to let you rebalance. But wait, it gets better. They had an entire calendar for this madness. Some days were best for draining blood from the left arm. Other days, right ankle, during the full moon, never the neck. That was dangerous. Mercury in retrograde? Stick with leeches. Some towns even had bloodletting festivals. Imagine it. Long queues of villagers, waiting patiently to get drained like wine casks. Then everyone stumbling home pale, dizzy, and oddly proud. And somehow, people survived this. Though, to be fair, many didn't. Still, for over 1,000 years, bloodletting was seen as noble, cleansing, holy, like an internal shower, but with more screaming. Anyway, let's leave the blood behind. We're headed towards something even more chewy. Yes, you heard that right. Cannibalism. But not the dramatic jungle kind. This was respectable, high-end, pharmacy-grade people eating. In medieval and early modern Europe, the remains of dead people, especially mummified ones, were ground up and used as medicine. Why? Because the logic went like this. A body that resisted decay must be full of life force. So if you ate it, you might borrow some of that staying power. Sounds smart, right? Number physicians prescribed mummy powder, made from actual Egyptian corpses, as a cure for headaches, bruises, bleeding, or just general weakness of the soul. You could snort it, drink it in wine, or rub it on wounds. Tastes like desecration. In Germany, they sold skull scrapings as an anti-epileptic remedy. In England, they drank blood fresh from executed criminals, believed to contain spirit of life. In France, human fat was rendered into balms and creams to treat arthritis, and no one blinked. It wasn't seen as cannibalism, it was just medicine. You die, you become a cure. Circle of life, medieval style. Of course, the irony? All of this was filthy, dangerous, and wildly ineffective. It treated nothing except maybe your ability to keep your dinner down. And still, you pay good money for it. Because when you're desperate enough, even ground up pharaoh dust sounds reasonable. Now we've had our fill of blood and bones. Let's talk about teeth next. Because the way they handled toothaches? Well, let's just say you're gonna love this next bit. Let's talk about teeth. Or rather, the absolute nightmare that was dentistry in the Middle Ages. There were no toothbrushes, no floss, no pepperminty relief. If your molars ached, your gums bled, or your breath could wilt a field of cabbage, you were told it wasn't your fault. The problem, clearly, was worms. Tiny, squirming worms, living inside your teeth. This wasn't just a rumour, it was widely believed. By scholars, by priests, by your neighbour's cousin who once saw a dentist die mid-surgery. The idea was simple. Tooth pain? Caused by a little beast gnawing away at your nerves. Probably put there by sin, of course, or bad air, or your personality. And the solution? Well, that's where it gets mousy. One cure involved taking a dead mouse. Yes, a real one. Boiling it in oil and applying the greasy result to your sore tooth. Sometimes it was wrapped in cloth. Sometimes it went directly in your mouth. Yes, that warm, oiled rodent. Between your cheek and gum. Healing. Another method involved fumigating your head. You'd sit with your mouth open over a steaming bowl of herbs and sulphur, hoping the heat would smoke the worm out. Spoiler. It didn't. There were also charms, coins tied to your neck, spells mumbled at dawn, and mixtures of garlic, onion, and menstrual blood. Basically, anything but actual dental work. Because pulling teeth, that was a last resort, done with rusty pliers by a guy who also trimmed hooves on Sundays. No anaesthetic, no aftercare, just a shot of ale and a scream into the void. So next time your dentist asks if you've been flossing, just remember, at least they're not stuffing mice in your mouth. Now, let's move on to something a little more emotionally draining, because bloodletting may have been trendy, but in some places, it was practically a festival. Imagine this. You walk into the village square. It's market day. There's bread, shouting, pigs wandering about, and a line of people, arms out, sleeves rolled up. Why? Because it's bloodletting day. It was considered a cleansing ritual, a medical treatment, and a great excuse to miss work. Entire towns would gather at the barber surgeon's tent, the guy with the red and white pole, and queue for their turn to be drained, sometimes by blade, sometimes by bowl, sometimes by leech. Yes, leeches. Squishy, wiggly, cold-blooded little freeloaders. Gently placed on your body, usually your arms, legs, or temples, and left there until they were fat and satisfied. They were so popular they nearly went extinct. And the belief? that they were removing bad blood, letting your body rebalance itself, letting evil thoughts drain out with the plasma. In some regions, people even celebrated their sessions. They compared the colours, the dizziness. Oh, you fainted. Lucky you. That means it worked. Bleeding was fashionable. Some nobles did it monthly, like a facial. And if the bleeding made you weak, even better. That meant you were humble. It meant you were spiritually cleansed. And physically, slightly dying. So if someone looked pale, lightheaded, and vaguely enlightened, odds are they'd just been bled yesterday, and were on their way back next week. The leech was life. But don't worry. Tonight, we won't be attaching any. Instead, we'll move on to something more digestible, sort of. Because coming up next, it is what happens when food becomes a superstition. And pregnancy gets tested with cheese. South. You suspect you're pregnant. Your period's late, your ankles are swelling, and your dreams are full of weird farm animals. But this is the Middle Ages. There are no pregnancy tests, no clinics, just a whole lot of guesswork. And dairy. One of the more curious customs involved this. Cheese soaked in urine. Yes, we're back to pee again. And yes, the cheese is involved. The test was simple. A wise woman, or your aunt, or your neighbour who once gave birth to twins, would take a small chunk of soft cheese, and then, very delicately, place it into a bowl of your urine. Then came the waiting, not just for a few minutes, but hours, sometimes days. They watched the cheese, observe it, how it curdled, how it swelled, how it interacted. If the cheese changed in a particular way, if it fizzed, cracked, or floated strangely, the verdict was in, you were pregnant. If not, well, maybe next month. Or maybe you've been hexed. Cheese was never entirely clear on that point. Of course, not everyone used cheese. Some swore by barley seeds. You'd pee on two types, barley and wheat, and whichever sprouted first would tell you not only if you were pregnant, but also the gender of your future child. All that. From a bit of grain and wee. To be fair, some of these ancient pea-based methods were accidentally sort of accurate. Grain does react differently to hormonal urine, but still, we're talking about sniffing cheese on purpose. It's not exactly modern science. Then again, it was better than some of the alternatives, like swallowing mercury, or drinking rabbit blood, or simply being told by a priest that God will decide. At least with the cheese, you got a snack out of it. Although, probably not one you'd want to eat afterwards. Now, let's step away from the dairy aisle, and into something slightly darker. Because the next custom is all about honouring the dead by eating on top of them. Imagine this. You're at a funeral. Everyone's weeping. The bell tolls. The priest mumbles something about dust and bones. And then lunch is served. On the coffin. Yes. On the coffin. This wasn't rare. In many parts of medieval Europe, it was tradition to eat and drink directly on the grave or casket of the deceased. Bread, cheese, ale, sometimes a whole roast pig. All lovingly spread out over the freshly sealed resting place of your loved one. Why? Because it was believed the soul of the dead could bless the food, and that by sharing it you could absorb a little of their virtue, or at least their luck, their courage, their good standing with God. Kind of like spiritual inheritance, but edible. And if you were especially superstitious, you'd save a bite of that funeral bread, keep it in your pocket, use it to ward off demons, or mix it into dough for your next child's first meal. So they'd be brave like Grandpa. Of course, not everyone found this comforting. Some thought it was unclean, unholy, too close to cannibalism. And to be fair, eating a sandwich while standing on someone's grave isn't exactly Michelin star etiquette. But in their minds, it was sacred. It was intimate. A way to stay close, to honor, to remember. To never dine alone again. Besides, the beer was probably the cleanest thing in the entire village, and the table was already set. Let's keep moving. The next custom involves medicine. Sort of. Because now, we enter the world of human-based remedies. And no, that wasn't a metaphor. In the medieval mind, death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new career. As medicine. Human remains, bones, blood, fat and ashes were used in healing potions, powders, and ointments. And not secretly. Openly. Proudly. Physicians prescribed mummy dust, ground from Egyptian corpses, as a cure for everything from headaches to internal bleeding. It was imported, expensive, and often fake, but that didn't matter. Because what people wanted was essence. Something that had survived. Something ancient. Something potent. They believed that consuming the dead could strengthen the living. A sort of metaphysical transfusion. If a body had resisted decay, maybe it held power. And if you took that power into yourself, you might resist decay too. So skulls were powdered, blood was bottled, often from executed criminals, still warm. Even the fat of hanged men was collected, melted down and rubbed on arthritic joints. It was called man's grease, used for pain relief, and sometimes to anoint weapons. There was also moss of the skull, a lichen scraped from graveyard bones, boiled into tonics. And if you were rich enough, you could buy bezoars, calcified lumps from animal stomachs, said to cure poison. Sometimes human bezoars were used too. People didn't even flinch. If the body was holy, even better. The blood of a saint, the tooth of a martyr. Not just relics, remedies. You think modern medicine has strange side effects? Try explaining smeared corpse fat to your insurance. Let's move away from the dead now. They've given enough. It's time to check in on the living. Specifically, women. Because next, we enter the strange and sticky world of medieval childbirth. A realm of superstitions, screams and string. No hospitals, no doctors, just you, a midwife, a dark room, and a rope. In many medieval cultures, women gave birth in special huts or sealed off chambers. The windows were covered, mirrors removed, all metal hidden away, in case it attracted demons, and from the ceiling hung a thick rope. It wasn't decorative, it was essential. Women in labour would stand, not lie down, and clutch the rope above their heads. They'd scream, push, bite it, twist it. Sometimes they braided herbs into it, rosemary for protection, mugwort for strength. The pain was immense, the fear worse, because childbirth wasn't just dangerous, it was mystical. The mother's soul was thought to leave her body during labour, hovering between worlds. And if you weren't careful, something else might slip in. So salt was scattered, iron placed under the bed. Knots were untied around the house, laces, locks, even braided bread, to let the baby find its way. If the child was born with the cord wrapped around its neck, it was cursed. If it was born in the caul, it was blessed, maybe even magical. And if the birth took too long, you called in a cunning woman, who'd whisper spells into the fire, or burn the father's hair, or fetch a splinter from a gallows beam. Whatever worked. Because when survival hangs by a thread, any thread will do, even if it's attached to the ceiling. Let's step outside that chamber now. Take a breath. Shake the salt from our shoes. Our next stop? The field of battle. But not war. We're talking about fashion. Specifically, the kind you were forced to wear. It always started with a whisper. A woman at the well. A drunk in the tavern. A jealous neighbour with too much time and not enough crops. He said something about the bailiff. She talks too much. He made fun of Father Albrecht's goats. Not crimes, not really. But in certain towns, words were enough. Enough to shame you. Enough to dress you up. You wouldn't be flogged. You wouldn't be jailed. You'd be displayed. You see, in the Middle Ages, there existed a special punishment for those who misused their mouths. Not for liars or thieves or killers. They had more straightforward endings. No. This was for those who gossiped. For those who spoke when they should have stayed silent. For those who dared to mock someone slightly more powerful than them. The punishment? A mask. Not the ceremonial kind. Not elegant. Not decorated. Not kind. But iron. Rough. Cold against the skin. Some were shaped like pigs. Others had grotesque faces. Huge tongues. Oversized noses. They were made to match the crime. Long tongue for a gossip. Donkey ears for a fool. Devil horns for anyone who challenged the church's patience. And you'd wear it. In public. Through the market. Sometimes tied to a cart. Sometimes to a post. Sometimes to nothing at all. Just left there to sweat under the weight of iron and ridicule. The worst part wasn't the heat, or the weight, or the fact that you couldn't drink. It was that they laughed. Your friends. Your family. The children. The mask didn't just punish the body, it crushed the soul. Because you'd never quite outrun it again. You were the one who wore the nose. The one who had to rattle when they walked. The mask didn't correct your behaviour. It marked you. And if you were a woman, it was often worse. Scolding wives, they called them, for raising their voices or disagreeing with their husbands in public. They were masked, bound to chairs, sometimes made to wear signs. She who speaks shall suffer. The town would call it justice. But justice doesn't rattle, and it doesn't mock you as you walk home. The masks are long gone now, buried, forgotten, or hanging in museums where no one wants to touch them. But their echoes remain. In every moment someone is told to smile more, or to watch their tone. Now, let's take off the metal and step outside. There's water ahead, and it too was once a judge. They tied your wrists with rope, not too tight. They weren't trying to kill you, not directly anyway. You were told to pray. Some did, others cursed, but most stood silent, heart pounding louder than the crowd. You weren't alone. The whole village was watching. Some of them believed in your innocence, others whispered about witches. Some just wanted a good excuse to skip work. You were accused of a crime. Theft, maybe. Sorcery. A curse on the cow. A stillborn child. An unkind look. Nothing proven. But that never mattered. There was a way to settle things. They led you to the riverbank. Sometimes a pond. Sometimes a moat. And they threw you in. This was called trial by water. Ordeal by water if they were feeling dramatic. And it worked like this. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. Yes, that's the whole system. The belief was that water, pure, sacred, holy, would reject the wicked. Like oil on the surface, they'd rise. But the innocent, they'd be welcomed. Pulled down into the arms of the divine. Unfortunately, water doesn't breathe, and rope doesn't untie itself. People died. A lot. Even if they were pulled out in time, shivering, gasping, half drowned, the damage was done. Bodies were broken, reputations worse. You could survive the river and still not survive the people. Sometimes women were the target. Too pretty, too sharp, too unlucky. Witch, they whispered, tried to hex my harvest. Looked at my baby funny. She has herbs in her house. Into the water she went. She floated, burn her. She sank, bury her. They claimed it was divine judgment, but it was fear. It was control. It was the illusion of justice wrapped in weeds and wet skirts. The rivers know. They remember. Even now, when the banks are calm and the villagers long dead, if you stand still enough, you can almost hear it. The splash, the gasp, the silence. Let's walk on. The water has spoken, and we still have miles to go. The priest didn't look up. Not at first. He stood behind a simple wooden table, head bowed, hands resting on a single loaf of bread. Nothing fancy, no gold, no goblets. Just a dry, slightly stale hunk of barley bread. And yet, it carried the power to decide whether you lived or died. This was the ordeal of the morsel, also known as the trial by bread and cheese. A man accused of theft stood across from the table. Not a murderer, not a traitor, just a poor farmhand who had, allegedly, taken a duck. No witnesses, no evidence, only suspicion, and fear, and gossip. So they turned to God. Or rather, to God's opinion, expressed through baked goods. The ritual was simple. The accused would swear their innocence before the altar. Then, in the sight of the priest, the villagers, and a few bored chickens outside the chapel window, they would take a bite of holy bread. Blessed. Sanctified. Possibly 2 days old. And if they were lying, they would choke. Physically. Audibly. Spectacularly. The holy food would refuse to go down, as if justice itself had hands, reaching up through the throat saying, "Try again, liar." And if they swallowed without issue, they were innocent. Case closed. Praise be. No one asked about nerves, or dry mouth, or stage fright, or the fact that the priest occasionally forgot to offer water. No, no. The bread knew. The bread always knew. That day, the farmhand took the bite. He chewed, he swallowed. He stared straight ahead. 1 second, 2, 3, nothing. The priest gave a nod. The villagers mumbled. Someone clapped, awkwardly. He was free to go. Not because he was proven innocent, but because a piece of barley didn't get stuck in his throat. And that, in medieval law, was enough. Now, this wasn't the only food-based justice system. Some towns used cheese, some added rituals, others preferred trials with hot irons or boiling water. But this one, this quiet little mouthful of divinity, persisted for centuries because it was easy, cheap, and dramatic. It also reminded everyone watching, even the simplest things could be sacred, or dangerous, or both. And somewhere out there, a duck lived another day, unaware that it had nearly been the catalyst for an execution by crouton. Let's walk on, friend, away from bread and priests, towards something older, darker, and hairier. Because the next custom, it's about what you wear when the shame is permanent. Some garments were stitched with silk. Some were stitched with shame. In certain corners of the medieval world, when someone made a fool of themselves, or worse, embarrassed someone important, they weren't just scolded. They were dressed for the occasion, and nothing said, "You're officially ridiculous." Quite like a pair of enormous floppy donkey ears. Sometimes they were made of cloth, sometimes of paper, sometimes nailed onto a wooden cap that balanced just so on your already humiliated head. You didn't get to choose the colour, or the fit, but you did get to walk through the village wearing them, preferably while someone banged a drum and children threw things at your knees. This was public penance. And while it might sound theatrical, and it absolutely was, it was also lethal to dignity, because you couldn't outrun it. The ears followed you. If you were lucky, it only lasted a day. If you weren't, you wore the hat until your behaviour improved, or until everyone forgot why you were wearing it in the first place. Some people wore bells too, so they'd jingle when they walked, as if shame alone wasn't loud enough. This fashion wasn't reserved for simple fools, tax dodgers, gossipers, bakers who watered down their dough, midwives who delivered suspiciously fast, women who read too much, men who drank too little. Everyone was fair game. One man, a blacksmith, was caught urinating on the Lord's favourite tree. He spent 3 days wearing a hat shaped like a toilet seat, or so the records say. Another, a woman who made fun of her husband's bald spot, was made to wear a wooden collar with a mirror on it, so she could reflect on her words. Medieval justice, you see, had a flair for symbolism. The point wasn't just punishment, it was theatre. People watched, they laughed, they judged, and by watching you, they remembered how easy it was to become the next fool. And so the ears flopped, and the bells rang, and shame strutted through the mud, hoping not to trip. Let's move on now. Slip off the donkey hat, brush the mockery from your shoulders. Because the next custom, it wasn't about what you wore. It was about what lived inside you, or rather, what people thought did. We're heading into medical territory. Brace yourself. There are worms involved. There's a special kind of pain that humbles even the loudest souls. It starts small. Maybe a dull ache while you chew, or a twitch behind your eye. But then it grows, becomes sharp, blinding, constant. A toothache. Today, you'd call your dentist. Back then, you were told one thing. There's a worm in your tooth. Yes, a worm, living inside your mouth, feeding, wriggling, whispering pain into your bones. This wasn't a rumour. This was accepted medical fact. Physicians, priests, barbers, everyone believed it. If your mouth hurt, it meant a tiny, squirming creature had taken up residence in your molar. And that meant it had to be removed. But how do you evict something you can't see? One method involves smoke. The healer would take a long, funnel-shaped pipe, fill it with herbs, henbane, garlic, or dried dung, and light it. Then, gently, they'd blow the smoke into your mouth, right into the cavity. The goal? To smoke the worm out, like a wasp's nest, in your face. If that didn't work, they tried heat, scalding oil, dripped carefully into the aching tooth, or a hot poker pressed to the jaw, or a boiled mouse. Yes, a mouse, dead of course, boiled in oil, then wrapped in linen and pressed to your cheek. Sometimes placed in the mouth, letting its warmth and grease somehow convince the worm to retreat. There were poultices made from herbs and menstrual blood. Charms hung around your neck. Incantations whispered at dawn. But if none of it worked, then the tooth came out. With pliers, with knives, with whatever was available. There was no anesthetic, no apology. You were held down, and the worm, real or not, was removed with the tooth that sheltered it. Sometimes the pain went away, sometimes it didn't, but the people believed. Not in bacteria, not in nerves, but in the worm. Always the worm. So next time your dentist offers you a numbing gel, maybe say thank you. And be glad there's no rodent in the room. Let's close our mouths now. Let the worms rest wherever they are. The next tale takes us even deeper, into the rituals of life and death, and the belief that someone else's pain might cure your own. They gathered near the scaffold just before dawn. A small crowd, mostly silent, hoods pulled up, eyes down, not out of respect, but anticipation. Because when the axe fell that morning, it wouldn't just take a life. It would offer a cure. In parts of medieval Europe, blood wasn't just symbolic, it was medicinal, holy, potent, especially when it was fresh, especially when it came from a man who had just died violently, preferably guilty, but not always. It was believed that the blood of the recently executed held tremendous healing power. It still carried the soul, the spirit, the life force. And so, as the head rolled, as the body twitched, a few brave souls would rush forward with bowls, flasks, or just trembling hands. They'd collect the blood, warm, thick, still pulsing with whatever it was that made a man alive, and then they'd drink it for epilepsy, for chronic pain, for melancholy of the womb, for any affliction the local physician had already given up on. There are records of mothers feeding it to their sick children, of noblemen mixing it with wine and calling it a tonic, of beggars begging not for coins, but for blood. Some even pressed warm cloths soaked in the blood to their chests or foreheads, to absorb the essence, to draw out the sickness, to let the death of another extend their own life. It wasn't always voluntary, of course. The condemned didn't sign a release form. Their bodies were public domain. Their blood, a final gift, or a final violation, depending on whom you asked. And the belief didn't stop with blood. The fat of the dead was rendered into salves. The ashes of bones mixed into wine, the skull ground to powder, consumed in tiny pinches like spice or sacrament, to eat death in the hopes of escaping it. It sounds monstrous now, but back then, it was hope, warm, iron-rich, desperate. Let's step away from the scaffold, let the dead have their rest, and the living, their illusions. We're heading next into a quieter kind of ritual. Still strange, still sacred, but no blood involved. Just butter. The door creaked open just before sunrise. Not the front door, the pantry. Inside, a small bowl of butter, freshly churned, software yellow, and beside it, a knife, and a pair of shoes. No one spoke, because this was a quiet ritual, not one for sermons or witnesses, just hands and habit, and a very specific fear. In many rural parts of medieval Europe, butter wasn't just food. It was a ward, a weapon, a prayer, because people believed witches stole milk. Not just literally, but spiritually. They would curse the cow, sour the cream, dry up the udders, and suddenly your family was starving. So what did you do? You turned to butter. And rituals. One common practice. Smearing butter on door frames, on windowsills, on barn walls, anywhere a witch might slip in. Because everyone knew. Witches hated grease. They also hated iron, salt, and rosemary. But butter was personal, domestic. It was part of the hearth, the hand, the rhythm of daily life. In some villages, women would churn butter while reciting protective prayers. Line after line, in time with the paddles. Sometimes adding hair from the cow. Sometimes blood from the woman herself. And if the butter wouldn't churn, if it refused to come together, they knew someone had cursed it. To undo the spell, you could heat a horseshoe in the fire and plunge it into the cream, or hang your churn from a tree under the full moon, or bury a toad under the threshold and wait 3 days. Because nothing says reasonable agriculture like amphibian-based dairy protection. If a woman produced too much butter, she was suspicious. Too little? Also suspicious. And if a neighbour's cow suddenly stopped giving milk, the eyes turned toward the one with full baskets and quiet steps. Butter wasn't just food. It was status. It was survival. And when survival is fragile, suspicion spreads fast. Let's close the pantry door now. The butter's done its job. We're moving on to another kind of kitchen mystery. One that doesn't protect, but reveals. Because next, we're going to talk about what people used to tell if a woman was carrying life, or a curse. It started with suspicion. Maybe the girl had been quiet lately. Maybe she avoided the bread oven. Maybe someone noticed her hands trembling during prayer. Whatever it was, there came a point when the midwife was called, not to deliver, but to diagnose. There were no tests, no labs, no little blue lines, just urine and cheese. Yes, cheese. In many parts of medieval Europe, when a woman suspected, or was suspected of being pregnant, her urine would be collected and poured over a small lump of soft cheese. Goat's cheese, usually, or sometimes barley bread. Then the wise woman would wait and watch. If the cheese changed, if it puffed, cracked, or moved oddly, the woman was declared pregnant. If it stayed the same, not pregnant, or possibly cursed. The line between the two was often blurry. There was also the seed test. Wheat and barley were placed in separate bowls, soaked with the woman's urine, and observed over several days. If either sprouted, she was pregnant. If both did, the baby was a boy. If only one, a girl. If nothing sprouted, well, someone had likely cast a spell, or the soil was bad. But whoever blames the soil? These tests weren't just about curiosity, they had consequences. If a servant girl was found pregnant out of wedlock, she could lose her job, be sent away, or worse, be accused of seduction, or witchcraft, or both. If a noblewoman was suspected of hiding a pregnancy, the test could be used as evidence, even if the cheese said no. Because cheese isn't legally binding. Some midwives swore by these methods, others performed them just for show, already sure of the answer. Their real skill was in reading faces, not dairy, and sometimes the women themselves didn't want to know. Not truly, not until it was too late. They just wanted a sign, any sign, that life was growing, or not, that hope was safe, or not. The cheese is gone now, the seeds have dried, but the uncertainty, that part, never really left us. Let's step out of the cottage, leave the bowls behind. We're heading somewhere colder next, because while some waited for birth, others prepared for death, and believed that what a body wore after life could change everything. The body was washed in silence, not by strangers, not by priests, but by those who knew it best. A daughter, a sister, an old neighbor with steady hands. No one cried during the washing, not yet. It was sacred work, and timing mattered. The water had to be warm, the cloth clean, the motion slow. If you move too fast, the soul might get confused. If you pause too long, the devil might notice. Yes, because death was never just death. It was an opening, and you had to protect what remained. Once the washing was done, they dressed the body, not in his finest clothes, not always, sometimes in rough linen, sometimes in wool, but never with knots, no buttons, no ties, nothing that could trap the soul. They believed the soul needed to rise, freely, unhindered. Any knot, any loop, any complicated fastening might confuse it. Or worse, catch it. Keep it tethered to the body, to the pain. So garments were draped, not wrapped, left open at the throat, feet bare, or loosely covered. And in some places, they turned the clothes inside out, to trick evil spirits. Because if the devil couldn't recognize the garments, maybe he couldn't recognize the person wearing them either. A celestial game of hide and seek. Others added charms, salt sewn into hems, iron nails under the tongue, wax crosses on the chest, not to bless, to deflect, to ward off what watched from the other side. Even the direction of burial mattered. Feet facing east, always east, toward the rising sun, toward resurrection. Just in case that part turned out to be true, No one wanted to be left behind. There was a piece to it, though. This ritual, this preparation, this small human attempt at order in the face of something so vast, so final. A last kindness, a final defiance. The body was ready. The soul, hopefully, too. Let's walk away from the grave now. There's still breath in our lungs. But our next stop, it's not much warmer. Because now, we're heading into the kitchen again. But this time, the food isn't for the living. It's for the dead. They laid out the food on a long wooden table. Simple dishes, flatbread, dried meats, a pot of thick, smoky stew still steaming in the cold morning air, and beside it, an empty seat for the guest of honor. In many medieval communities, a funeral wasn't complete without a proper meal. But it wasn't just about feeding the mourners. It was about feeding the dead, or at least inviting them to stay for one last bite. The practice had many names. Some called it the soul supper, others the passing feast. But the idea was always the same. You honored the dead by sharing food with them, at the table, in the graveyard, or even on the coffin itself. Yes, in certain regions, food was literally placed on top of the casket. Cakes, cheese, ale, a symbolic offering, a sign of gratitude, and a very practical way to remind everyone, life goes on. Some people brought their own plates to the funeral. Others were handed bread the moment the sermon ended. In parts of Northern Europe, special loaves were baked just for the dead. Spiced with cloves, sweetened with dried fruit, scored with crosses, or sometimes with the name of the deceased. These were called corpse cakes, and yes, people ate them, together, in silence, sometimes dipped in wine. In other places, the bread was placed on the chest of the body, left there overnight, so the soul could pass through it, imprint itself, soak in, and in the morning, the family would eat it, to take in the spirit, to keep them close, to carry them forward. Mourners might even keep a crust in their pocket for days, a charm, a connection, a bite of memory. If the bread turned black, it meant the soul hadn't moved on. If mold appeared, it meant they were angry. If nothing happened, well, that was good enough. Today we eat in restaurants. We leave flowers. We light candles on cold stone. But back then, grief had a taste. Bread, salt, and the strange comfort of chewing while your heart cracked open. Let's clear the table now. Wipe the crumbs from the cloth. The dead have eaten. But we're not done yet. Because the next custom, it's about what happened before the body was buried, and how some believed that lying in the right place could heal the living. They didn't speak much as they laid her down, not because of grief, though there was plenty of that, but because silence was part of the ritual. The body had to be undisturbed, unprovoked, still, and the living, they had to lie down next to it. It was called Heilschlaf, or healing sleep. The belief was simple. Some bodies, holy ones, recently departed, or simply loved, still carried healing energy. And if you lay beside them just for a night, that energy could pass to you, a blessing by proximity, a final gift from someone already halfway to the other side. It wasn't always about saints. Sometimes it was a child lying beside a mother, or a man beside his brother, hands resting on the same blanket, breaths uneven, one slowing, one speeding up. There were rules. The room had to be dark. No fire burning, no prayers spoken aloud. You simply lay there, in silence, and waited. Some believed the warmth of the dead could cure fever. Others said it could bring fertility, banish nightmares, or draw out a lingering sickness. And sometimes, it was done out of desperation, when all herbs had failed, when the bleeding wouldn't stop. when the mind had fractured under grief or guilt or ghostly whispers, they would carry the afflicted to the body, place them gently beside it, and leave them there until sunrise. If the person woke feeling better, it was said the dead had taken the illness with them. If they didn't wake at all, well, perhaps they were meant to follow. Not all bodies were fresh. Sometimes they were days old, wrapped in cloth, stiff and cold. But still, the hope remained that something could pass between them. One soul pausing, another continuing. Today we call that superstition. Primitive, macabre. But there's something strangely gentle in it too. A belief that even in death, we might still hold each other one last time. Let's sit up slowly, stretch our limbs, shake the chill from our skin. We're done sleeping beside the dead. Next, we meet the ones who spoke to them, or at least claimed to. They were called many things: seers, listeners, wanderers between worlds. But most people just whispered, bone talkers. Not because they spoke to skeletons, though sometimes they did, but because they claimed to understand what the dead left unsaid. In the stillness of a graveyard, they'd kneel by a fresh mound of earth, eyes closed, hands flat on the ground, and they'd listen. Some said the voices came from below, muffled, tired, urgent. Others said the words came from inside. Not imagination, exactly, but a knowing. A message that arrived like a dream you weren't quite awake for. They were mostly women, old or young, but always strange. They spoke softly, rarely smiled, and always seemed to know when someone had died, even before the bell rang. People feared them, but they also came to them to ask, did he forgive me? Is she safe? Did they suffer? And the bone talkers would place one hand on a lock of hair, or a tooth, or a scrap of the burial shroud, and answer. Sometimes it was comforting. Other times, not. Because they didn't lie. Or if they did, they lied so well, it felt like truth. They weren't priests. They didn't wear robes. They weren't paid. Not officially. But people left gifts. Bread, wool, coins wrapped in cloth, a handful of herbs tied with red string. And in return, the bone talker would light a candle, burn sweet smoke, and say what the dead could no longer say for themselves. In some regions, they were feared, banned, hunted. In others, they sat beside cribs, blessing babies so they wouldn't hear the dead by accident. Because once you hear them, you never quite stop. Let's leave the grave now. Step back into the sunlight. Or what passes for it in this world. We're not done with death yet. But the next custom, it's not about spirits. It's about teeth. And why some people buried them. Not in their own mouths, but in walls. The child's tooth had been loose for days. She played with it, tongued it, worried it like a secret. And when it finally came free, she ran straight to her mother, not for a coin, but for a hammer. Because in this village, you didn't throw teeth away. You didn't keep them. You didn't bury them in the garden or leave them under a pillow for some imaginary fairy. You hid them. In the walls, behind the fireplace, beneath the floorboards, inside the beams over the door, to protect the house, to protect the child, to confuse the spirits that might come looking for something small, familiar, and easy to follow home. This wasn't rare. In fact, it was everywhere. Archaeologists have found teeth tucked into plaster, pressed between bricks, wrapped in cloth and hidden inside chimneys, alongside dead birds, shoes, locks of hair, and once, an entire toad, mummified and smiling. The walls of medieval homes were like time capsules of anxiety. People believed the human body left traces, vulnerabilities, hair, nails, teeth, Anything that had once been you could be used against you. By witches, by the restless dead, by fate. So instead of burning them, they hid them. Inside the house itself. Some believed the teeth would act as guardians. Others thought they would distract malevolent forces. Here, take this part of me, and leave the rest alone. Sometimes it was just habit. You didn't ask why. You just knocked 3 times, wrapped the tooth in wool, and slid it into the crack by the hearth. Generations lived in houses like that. Walls full of whispers. Floors built on forgotten bones. Each room a little safer, a little more protected, by the things no one spoke about. Today, we move walls to make room for radiators. We scrape away plaster. We renovate. And every now and then, someone finds a bundle. Wrapped tight, dry as dust. Still holding the shape of a fear long buried. Let's leave the house now. Close the door gently. We're heading into colder places again. Places where the body wasn't just feared, but used. Because next, we'll talk about fat, and the many, many things they did with it. The man didn't scream, not yet. He clenched his teeth, stared at the ceiling, and waited. The wound was fresh, an arrow to the thigh, deep, red, and already turning purple around the edges. What came next wasn't medicine, not exactly, but it was something. The healer crouched beside him, whispered a prayer maybe, then opened a small clay jar. Inside, a pale, waxy paste, with a smell that didn't quite belong to any plant or oil. It was human fat. Yes. The rendered fat of a man, usually taken from someone recently executed, or freshly buried. Sometimes even harvested straight from a battlefield, collected, melted, poured into jars, stored like lard, used like magic. It was believed to reduce pain, to stop bleeding, to protect against infection. Some healers mixed it with beeswax, others added herbs, sage, rosemary, crushed bone. A few even combined it with ash from burned teeth, or threads from a burial shroud. The most prized fat came from hanged men. Their bodies were said to be full of spiritual tension, a kind of trapped energy. Their death, slow and stretched, had charged them, and their fat absorbed that charge. It was called human grease in some places, used on joints, swollen bellies, painful limbs, sometimes smeared on swords before battle to make the blade strike more deeply. Some thieves rubbed it on their feet before breaking into houses to make themselves light, invisible, or harder to catch. Because why settle for shoes when you could have dead man lotion? It sounds grotesque now, and it was. But it came from desperation. Wounds festered. Infection killed faster than weapons. And when all you had was what the dead left behind, you used it. There were those who refused, of course, who said it was evil, a curse, an abomination. But even they came knocking when the fever wouldn't break. The jar is empty now. The wound is bandaged. The healer is gone. And we're walking away from blood and fat. Our next stop is quieter, colder, but somehow even stranger. Because next we talk about shoes. But not the kind you wear. The kind you bury under your floor, for luck, or something darker. It was old, misshapen, cracked along the sole. The lace is gone, the leather stiff with time and silence. But still, they didn't throw it away. Instead, they hid it under the floorboards, behind the hearth, inside the chimney breast, sometimes buried in the wall, wrapped in cloth, tucked in like a secret. This wasn't storage, it wasn't forgetfulness, it was intentional. Because in many homes across medieval and early modern Europe, people deliberately hid single shoes inside their houses. Not in pairs, not polished, not clean, worn, used, lived in, preferably smelly. Because the smell, that deep human musk left in the lining, was part of the magic. These were called concealed shoes, and they were everywhere. Historians have found them in cottages and castles, barns and bakeries, churches and inns, always hidden, never spoken of, because they weren't meant to be seen. They were meant to protect. People believed the shoe could act as a decoy, trick evil spirits into entering it, instead of the people in the home. It could trap curses, divert lightning, ward off witches, demons, nightmares, sometimes even infertility. Some women hid them under the marriage bed, others placed them near the cradle. One was found buried beneath a doorway with a tooth tucked inside. Double protection, perhaps. No one knows exactly how it started. There are no manuals, no sermons, just shoes. So many shoes. And the thing is, they worked. At least people believed they did. And sometimes belief is all a house really needs. Let's cover the floorboards again. Leave the shoe where it is. It's done its job for centuries. We're heading somewhere else now, not into a home, but into a prison. Because next, we'll talk about silence and isolation, and a punishment so cruel it broke people without ever laying a hand on them. They didn't beat him. They didn't chain him. They didn't even speak to him. They simply led him into a room. Stone walls, no window, a single wooden stool, and then they closed the door. That was it. This was one of the cruelest forms of medieval punishment. Isolation. But not just solitude. A full sensory void. You were given nothing. No one. No food sometimes. No time. Just your breath. Your heartbeat. And the sound of your own mind turning on itself. Some called it mercy. Because the body remained untouched. No blood spilled. No bones broken. But that was a lie. The silence did the breaking. Just more slowly. People went mad in those rooms. Started talking to the cracks in the wall. Singing songs they didn't know they remembered. Ripping their own hair out just to feel something. Some begged for pain. Anything sharp, loud, real. But they were given silence. And time. And that was worse. There was a logic to it, of course. The belief was that with no distractions, no sound, no contact, no light, the soul would be forced to confront itself. To repent. To see the truth. To become obedient. But mostly, it shattered people. There are records of men who emerged unable to speak, who flinched at light for the rest of their lives, who forgot their names, who remembered them too clearly. It wasn't always done in a prison. Sometimes it happened in monasteries, or schools, or homes, wherever silence was easy to enforce, and cruelty could hide behind the word discipline. Let's leave the cell now, quietly. Too much silence becomes a scream, and we're heading into noise next. Laughter, drums, parade bells, because next comes shame in motion. The festival began at dawn, not with music or bells, but with the slow, deliberate clanging of a cowbell tied to a man's neck. He stumbled into the square, pushed forward by two guards. His clothes had been replaced with a rough wool tunic, dyed bright yellow. On his head, a set of tall, floppy ears, stitched hastily from sackcloth and stiffened with ash. People gathered. Children laughed. And someone beat a drum that was always slightly offbeat. Intentionally, of course. It wasn't supposed to sound beautiful. It was supposed to sound stupid. This was the punishment known in some regions as the donkey dance. A public ritual of ridicule. Equal parts justice, theatre, and social glue. The crime? Usually something petty. Drunkenness. Gossip. Disrespect. Or just being on the wrong side of a powerful man's patience. But the punishment? That was designed to linger. The man was made to march. Through muddy streets. Past every stall. Every doorstep. He had to bray like a donkey on command. fall to his knees, apologize to bread loaves and to dogs. A child was sometimes chosen to lead him, holding a rope tied loosely to his waist. A reminder that, for today, even the smallest among them had power over him. If he hesitated, more braying. If he complained, they'd add bells to his ankles, or pin a tail to his back. Some towns were creative. They'd assign chants for the crowd. Look who drank the wine. Look who lied to the miller's wife. Look who thinks he's better than us. The point was never to hurt. Not physically. It was to shrink him. To rub out the edges of pride. To remind everyone watching what happens when you forget your place. And when it was over, when the ears were taken off and the bells stopped ringing, the man was allowed to walk home. But he never really left the square. For weeks, sometimes months, people would imitate his limp, his whimper, his ridiculous donkey cry. And just like that, his shame became part of local memory. A kind of folklore, passed on like a warning. They called it justice, but really it was a story told in reverse. You don't start with the truth, you start with the spectacle, and hope the truth crawls out of it later. Let's move on. The drums have stopped, the crowd has scattered, but the next custom? Well, it's not exactly quieter, because next we step into a courtroom, where the accused doesn't walk on two legs, and the sentence? Still deadly. Somewhere in France, in the year 1386, a pig was led into court. She had been dressed for the occasion. A simple tunic draped over her back, ears cleaned, hooves washed. She was placed in a wooden pen in front of the judge's bench. The bailiff read the charges out loud, and the courtroom fell silent. The charge? Murder. This was not a joke, not a fable, not a symbolic performance. It was a real, legal animal trial. You see, in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't limited to humans. If a pig killed a child, if a horse kicked its master to death, if a cow trampled someone in the wrong field, they could be arrested, tried, and if found guilty, punished. And this pig had allegedly attacked a 3-year-old boy, fatally. Witnesses were called, testimonies given. The local executioner was summoned in advance, just in case. No lawyer was appointed for the pig, though in some cases animals did have legal defenders, especially when the case involved a group of animals. Yes, there were mass trials, involving rats, mice, even locusts. In one town, the rats were accused of ruining crops. They were summoned to appear in court. When they failed to show up, their appointed lawyer argued that travel was dangerous because the cats in the area posed a legitimate threat to his clients. He won the delay. Not the case, of course, just the delay. Because the courts took it seriously. The verdicts were entered into official records. The punishments carried out. Some animals were hanged, others burned. Some were excommunicated, banished from the village, marked as cursed. It wasn't just rural superstition. Theologians debated it. Philosophers wrote about it. Could an animal sin? Could it possess intent? Did it deserve to die? Publicly. Today it seems absurd. But back then, it was logic wrapped in ritual. A society so obsessed with order, even the livestock had to obey. The pig in that French courtroom was found guilty. She was hanged in the village square, witnessed by the same people who had raised her, fed her, but now watched her swing. Let's leave the courthouse now, brush the straw off our sleeves. Justice in this town has been served. But our next custom, it has nothing to do with animals, and everything to do with pain, because now we're stepping into the trial of heat. A glowing iron, a steady hand, and the belief that God never lets the innocent burn. It was called the Ordeal of Hot Iron, a trial by fire, not in the poetic sense, but in the most literal, blistering way imaginable. You were accused of a crime. There were no witnesses, no confession, but there was doubt. And in the absence of proof, the community turned to someone they trusted. Not the priest, not the magistrate, but God. And what better way to let him decide than to ask fire to speak? Here's how it worked. The accused, usually barefoot, usually terrified, was led to the center of the church. A metal rod was placed in the fire, left there until it glowed red, until the very air around it shimmered with heat. And then the accused was asked to pick it up. Not for long, just a few steps. 3 usually. Carrying the rod in bare hands, held out in front of them like an offering. Then they dropped it. And the real ordeal began. The priest would bind the burned hand in linen, wrapped carefully, sealed with wax. And for 3 days, no one was allowed to look. They called it the waiting period. Time for the divine to make its judgment visible. On the 3rd day, in a quiet ceremony, the priest would unwrap the bandage. If the wound was clean, not festering, not swollen, it was a sign from heaven, innocent. But if the burn had blistered, if the skin had turned black or oozed, guilty. There were variations. Some people had to carry the iron only a short distance. Others walked across burning plowshares. And in a few cases the iron wasn't carried at all, but pressed directly into the skin. Women accused of infidelity. Servants suspected of theft. Pilgrims caught with forged relics. All put to the flame. The logic was brutal, but it made sense. To them. If God protected the righteous, he would surely keep their wounds from infection. Right? Right. Of course, we know now. Infection has nothing to do with guilt. Blisters don't care who you prayed to. But back then, people watched the bandage being opened as if the heavens themselves would answer. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, you carried the scar for the rest of your life. A mark left not by justice, but by fire. Let's cool our hands now. Step away from the altar. The flames have spoken, but the crowd isn't done yet. Because next comes punishment on wheels. No fire, no iron, just mud, mockery, and a cart full of regret. They didn't drag you. Not this time. They lifted you. Barefoot, filthy, still trembling, and hoisted you into a wooden cart. It was old, splintered, used more often for manure than for people. But today, it had one purpose: shame on wheels. This was the shaming cart, a mobile courtroom, a punishment stage, and a very public lesson rolled through every muddy street. You weren't strapped in. You didn't need to be. Because what held you there wasn't rope. It was humiliation. The crime varied. Adultery, fraud, slander. Maybe you sold watered wine. Maybe you mocked the wrong man. Whatever it was, you were now the centerpiece of a slow procession designed to grind. Your dignity into the cobblestones. They dressed you up, not nicely. Maybe they gave you a headdress made from pig intestines. Maybe they hung a sign around your neck. Thief, liar, unmarried and loud. In some towns, they rubbed ash on your face, or flour, or worse. And the cart moved slowly. So everyone had time to come out, to laugh, to spit, to throw cabbage if they were polite. Stones if they weren't. The shame cart didn't just carry the guilty. It carried a message. It said, don't be like this. Know your place. Stay small. Women were frequent passengers, especially those who didn't conform. Too loud, too sexual, too clever. One baker's wife was accused of gossiping about a bishop. She was paraded through town with a dead fish tied to each ear. The crowd howled. The ride usually lasted an hour, sometimes longer. Sometimes it ended with a fine, sometimes with a dunk in the river. Once in a while, it didn't end at all. Some people never walked proudly again. Some left town that same night. Because shame, when paraded through your own front yard, doesn't fade quickly. Let's step down from the cart now, careful of the mud. We've seen what happens when the body is mocked. Next, we'll look at what happens when the body itself is controlled. Not through punishment, but through steel. And we'll ask the question no one really wants answered. Did chastity belts actually exist? You've seen the image before. A heavy metal belt, locked tight around a woman's hips, with a small slit for bodily functions, no key in sight. A cage of modesty, a prison of purity. It's always described the same way. The chastity belt, the ultimate medieval invention of control. A tool designed to keep women pure while their husbands rode off to war. But here's the truth. Almost none of it is real. Yes, there are a few belts in museums. Iron, leather, laced with rivets and panic. But most of those were made centuries after the Middle Ages. Some even as late as the 19th century. As gag gifts, as curiosity pieces, as strange relics of imagined history. There's almost no credible record of chastity belts being worn in the medieval period. No letters, no trials, no first-hand accounts, no skeletal remains showing injury from constant wear. And yet, the myth lives. Why? Because it fits the story we want to believe. A story about controlling women, about the extremes of patriarchy, about desire and denial and ownership. The idea is horrifying. And that's precisely why it stuck. It's the same reason we believe in Iron Maidens. Another invention more Victorian than medieval. The Middle Ages became our cultural haunted house, and we filled it with monsters. But there were controls. Of course there were. Just not made of metal. There were strict codes of conduct. Marriages arranged before puberty. Veils. Locks on doors. Confessions extracted under threat of sin. The cage wasn't worn on the body. It was written into daily life. And yet, there's something powerful in the image. A chastity belt. Cold. Closed. Unmistakable. Even if it's mostly fantasy, it forces us to confront how far people will go to possess another person's body, not just in history, even now. Let's step away from the display case. The metal's been polished for tourists. Our next step is softer, but no less magical. We're heading to the hairbrush, to braids, and strands of protection twisted into quiet spells. Because next, we talk about hair, and the power it once held. The girl sat by the hearth, her hair unbraided, spilling over her shoulders like a curtain of night. Her mother combed it slowly, not roughly, not gently, just with purpose. Each stroke carried a rhythm, each twist, a quiet intention. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the hair was listening. In the Middle Ages, hair wasn't just appearance, it was meaning. For women, especially, it carried layers of identity. Social status, sexual availability, spiritual purity. Loose hair meant unmarried. Covered hair meant faithful. Shorn hair often meant punished. But beneath all that, there were older meanings. Whispered ones. Hair was protection. Hair was power. Hair was spellcraft. Some mothers braided salt into their daughters' hair before sending them to market. Others stitched tiny amulets into ribbons. A braid tied tight before travel meant safety. A lock of hair hidden in a lover's satchel meant devotion or obsession. And in times of fear, a single strand might be wrapped around a thorn and buried under the doorstep. A simple spell to keep misfortune away. Witches were said to steal hair from sleeping children, to bind them, to curse them, to gain control over their dreams. So hair was guarded, burned after cutting, buried if lost, sometimes kept in pouches around the neck for strength. Not everyone believed, of course, but few dared to disbelieve fully, because hair, once cut, still held something. Memory, maybe, spirit, a thread between what had been and what still could be. And in some cases, women cut their own hair as a form of rebellion. A widow refusing to remarry, a girl leaving the convent, a wife punished too often. Hair was grown, and taken, and kept. Let's leave the hearth now. The braid is finished. The last strand tucked in. We're heading toward birth again. Not the moment itself, but the women who stood at its edge. Next, we meet the midwives, and the quiet superstitions hidden in their satchels. She arrived at dusk. Not with a lantern, but with a bundle of cloth, a pouch of herbs, and a reputation that preceded her. The midwife. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a nun. She wasn't trained in any university. But when the blood came, when the screams rose, when life teetered between this world and the next, she was the one they called. Midwives were trusted, but never quite trusted. They knew too much, said too little, and always carried something strange in their apron. A black thread knotted 9 times, a nail taken from a coffin, a piece of bread with a bite missing, a scrap of parchment with a psalm no one else could read. They called it superstition, but to the midwife, it was survival. Because birth wasn't just biology, it was chaos, it was spirit, it was bleeding, and breath and death all at once, and so she came prepared. Some rubbed lard on the door hinges to help the baby pass through more easily. Some laid an iron key under the bed to ward off evil spirits. Some refused to speak aloud during the pushing for fear of attracting the wrong kind of attention. She knew herbs, yes, but she also knew when to call for silence, when to whisper, when to step outside and bury the placenta under the 3rd tree on the left. Because that's where the foxes wouldn't find it. Midwives were powerful, and power in a woman's hands was always dangerous. Some were accused of witchcraft, of causing miscarriages, of stealing babies' breath, of knowing the wrong prayer or the right one too well, but most were simply necessary. And when the child came, covered in blood and wonder, the midwife would smile, tie the cord, wash her hands, and vanish back into the evening. Let's follow her out now, back into the chill air, because death and life are too close here. And next, we'll walk toward the sound of a bell, not rung for time, but for souls. It's called the death knell, and its meaning went far beyond morning. The first bell rang at dawn, one long heavy toll. It echoed over rooftops, slid between alleys, and rolled across the fields like a breath held too long. No one asked who it was for. They already knew. This was the death bell, rung not just because someone had died, but so that the very soul of the depart could find its way. In the medieval world, death wasn't an ending, it was a crossing. And no one crossed alone. The bell was part of that journey. It had a name, the passing bell, or sometimes the soul bell. It was struck slowly, deliberately, and with exact rhythm. The number of tolls mattered. 3 for a child, 9 for a man, 6 for a woman. It wasn't just for the living. It was for them. So they'd know they'd been seen. So they wouldn't wander. So their spirit wouldn't linger in the corners of a house or the edge of a dream. The bell was also a warning. It told the village, make peace with your enemies, light a candle, say a prayer. Death has passed through. It may return. Sometimes the bell was rung before the person had even died, to scare off demons, to let the angels know they were needed, to tell the soul, it's time, you can go. Some believed the bell's sound could break curses, or send evil spirits scattering. Our guide lost souls like a lighthouse, and once the funeral came, there was another bell, the lich bell, rung as the body was carried toward consecrated ground. It was never rushed, never cheerful, always steady. The sound of that bell was part of growing up. Children learned to count the tolls, wives paused their stitching, men removed their hats, because that bell belonged to all of them. Someday it would toll for you. Let's step away from the churchyard. The sound is fading now, but next, we'll follow a stranger path. Not everyone who loves someone got to marry them in life, and so they did it after, because in the strangest corners of medieval lore, it was possible to marry the dead. They gathered in the chapel, small, quiet, dressed in black, but there was no coffin, no music, and no body. Only a portrait, a single ring, and a woman in a pale dress, standing alone at the altar. The man she was about to marry was already dead. This was a posthumous marriage. A legal, sacred, and heartbreakingly strange practice that allowed the living to wed the departed. It didn't happen often, but it did happen. In some places, especially in medieval France and later into the 18th century, the law made space for unfinished stories. If a man and woman were engaged, if the banns had been read, if the dowry agreed upon, and one of them died before the wedding, the living partner could petition to marry the dead one, in absentia, with church and legal approval. It was done for love, but also for inheritance, for legitimacy, for closure. Children born out of engagement could be legitimized. Families could honor a union that had been cruelly cut short. The ceremony was subdued. A priest, a witness or two, sometimes a candle left burning on an empty chair. The bride or groom would recite their vows to the silence, place a ring on a book, or a piece of cloth that had belonged to the dead. Sometimes they were told to wear black for the rest of their lives. And that was it. Married. Even if one heart had already stopped. Not everyone approved. Some called it morbid. Some whispered of ghosts, of spirits clinging too long, of love turned into something unnatural. But for the ones left behind, it was often the only way to say, I still choose you. Even now. Let's leave the chapel. Gently. The candle is still flickering. Next we'll enter a darker kind of ritual. Not of love, but of profit. Because soon, the dead weren't just married. They were stolen. It started with a shovel, not a scream, not a torchlit mob. Just the soft scrape of metal against earth. A body only days buried. The soil still fresh, still loose. The grave barely had time to settle. And yet, here they were, digging. This wasn't about hatred or revenge. It was business. Because in certain parts of the medieval world, and even more so later during the Renaissance, bodies became currency. Doctors needed to learn. Anatomy required cadavers. Dissections became public events. Scientific milestones, even theatre. But corpses weren't exactly available on demand. The church forbade it. Families guarded their dead fiercely, and the legal supply was limited. So some clever souls stepped in to meet the demand. They were called resurrectionists, not for their spiritual leanings, but because they raised the dead. Grave robbers, body snatchers, men who prowled cemeteries by moonlight with hooks, ropes, and a bottle of gin. They worked fast. No need to take the whole coffin. Just break the lid. Hook the body by the underarms. Drag it out. Strip it. leave the clothes behind because stealing clothing was theft. But corpse? That was a grey area. A legal loophole, you might say. Some worked alone, others ran in teams, feeding medical schools in major cities. London, Paris, Bologna, Padua. They were paid per body, more for men, even more for the young and whole. The poor were at higher risk. Unmarked graves, shallow digs, no watchers. Some families hired guards. Others installed iron cages over the graves. Mort safes, they were called. But even those didn't always work, because the demand had never stopped. And as long as medicine needed bodies, someone would be willing to dig them up. Let's step away from the grave now. Brush the dirt from your boots. We're almost through this shadowy stroll. Next, we'll look at something oddly gentle. Not stealing, not pain, but spitting. Yes, spitting on bread, on babies, on wedding dresses. Because apparently, that's what kept the bad luck away. The baby was only hours old, red-faced, wailing, and swaddled in a blanket that smelled faintly of herbs. The midwife cooed. The grandmother smiled. And the father leaned down and spat, just a small drop, onto the infant's forehead, then onto the tiny chest. Not with force, not with disgust, but with intention. This was spitting for luck, an ancient pre-Christian practice that never quite went away. In parts of medieval Europe, it was believed that saliva, especially fresh, warm, human saliva, held protective power. It could seal a blessing, ward off evil, trap sickness before it took hold. And so, people spat. They spat on newborns, to protect them from spirits that lurked in the threshold between life and death. They spat on wedding gowns, just a quick one, over the shoulder or into the hem, to keep jealousy at bay. They spat on bread before eating it, if someone had just spoken of illness. Because better to insult your meal than risk the plague. Even the sign of the cross, in early baptisms, was sometimes accompanied by a priest spitting lightly on the ground. Or in some cases, directly onto the child, to expel the devil. To remind Satan he wasn't welcome. To let the spirit world know, this one's taken. It wasn't considered gross, not then. Spit was personal. It came from the body. It carried your essence, your intention, your faith. A mother might spit into her child's hair before sending them to school. A lover might touch a finger to their tongue, then to a letter. It was messy magic. But it worked. At least they believed it did. Let's wipe our sleeves and move on. Because the next custom is quieter, tied in loops and knots, hidden in hems and sleeves. We're stepping into the secret world of binding magic. Strings, nails, hair, and how they were used to open or close the unseen. The bride stood at the doorway, dress ironed, hair pinned, shoes polished, but she couldn't walk through. Her foot refused. Her breath caught. Her chest felt tight. Someone had bound her. Not with rope, not with chains, but with a knot. In the Middle Ages, the belief in binding magic ran deep. A curse cast not with a scream, but with a twist of string behind closed doors. If you wanted to stop a wedding, you didn't need to object in church. You just needed a cord, 9 knots, and a few whispered words, spoken backward if you knew how. Hide it under a doorstep, in the bride's shoe, in the groom's sleeve, and then wait. Binding spells were used for all sorts of things. To stop a man from lying, to keep a woman from leaving, to prevent conception, or force it. And if knots weren't available, nails were. Iron nails, driven into door frames, or into dolls, or into bits of clothing stolen from the target. One in the heart, one in the mouth, one in the groin. It was part fear, part folklore, and entirely serious. Midwives sometimes used knots to control bleeding. Healers tied them during rituals for pain. Lovers wore tiny knots inside amulets, close to the skin, to keep their partner faithful. But you had to be careful. A knot tied wrong could trap the wrong spirit. A spell cast in haste could backfire. And if you died while bound, some said your soul couldn't leave the body. You'd wander, twisted up in invisible threads. To break a binding, you needed to reverse it, untie the knot, burn the string, bury the nail at a crossroads during a full moon. It wasn't just symbolism, it was control. In a world where most people had none, let's pull at the last thread now. The knot loosens, and next, we'll listen to a stranger kind of sound. Not bells, not crying, but deliberate, public, wailing. A pillow soaked with ritual. Tears made louder on purpose. The room was silent. Too silent. The body lay dressed, washed, surrounded by candles. But no one wept. Not yet. So they brought in the mourners. And with them, the public pillow. It was embroidered. Well used. Sometimes scented with herbs. Sometimes not. Its purpose? To catch tears. To soak up sorrow. And most importantly, to make grief louder. In parts of medieval Europe and well beyond, ritual mourning wasn't quiet. It was performance. Families, especially those with a name to protect, would hire women, often older, widowed, experienced, to come into the home and wail, not sniffle, not sob politely. Wail. Screaming, rocking, crying out the name of the dead again and again, tearing at hair, tearing at sleeves, letting the grief burst open like a cracked dam. The louder the cry, the more respected the dead. And if there was no one to cry, what did that say about the life they'd lived? So the pillow was passed, sat on laps, pressed into faces, soaked, not just in tears, but in duty. Sometimes it was burned after the burial, sometimes buried with the body, and in some places the pillow was saved, dried and reused by the next mourner, because grief, like linens, was recycled. The mourners were professionals, but they weren't faking. They carried decades of sorrow in their voices. They knew how to let it rise, how to echo off stone walls, how to make it sound like the earth itself was keening. And those watching, they wept too. Not because they were moved, but because not crying looked suspicious. Grief was communal, expected, graded even, and the pillow told the story. Let's leave the room now. Wipe our eyes, real or not. We're nearly at the end. But before we go, there's one more thing to see. The quiet comfort of the strange. The magic of the absurd. A final walk through the oddities that made the Middle Ages not just brutal, but human. Let's take a breath. Not because you're tired, but because we've wandered through some very peculiar territory. Drinking blood, wearing shoes filled with teeth, trying to detect adultery with cheese, wailing into embroidered pillows. It's tempting to laugh, to shake our heads and say, what were they thinking? But the truth is, they were thinking exactly what we think now. That the world is dangerous, that life is fragile, that people lie and love and suffer and hope. They just had fewer tools. So they used what they had. They used bells to guide souls, butter to detect curses, nails to hold down invisible fears, spit to protect newborns, and rituals, dozens of them, to make sense of the unknown. Were they strange? Absolutely. But they were also comforting, because every strange custom, every odd little practice, carried a whisper of something deeply familiar. I want to keep my loved ones safe. I want to know what's coming. I want control, even when everything is chaos. They weren't fools. They were humans, doing what we all do, dressing the darkness in symbols, tying up fear with string, and praying, quietly or loudly, that something out there was listening. Let's hold on to that, because the final chapter is next. No more trials, no more teeth, just a soft, strange goodbye to the beautiful mess we call the Middle Ages. And that was just a glimpse into the weird, the wild, and the wonderfully ridiculous world of medieval customs. Thanks for staying with me through this quiet little detour through time. If you like this strange ride, subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and tell us in the comments, what's the weirdest tradition that still exists where you live? We're the new kid in town, and every bit of support helps. Seriously. Early days are tough, even for a bunch of history nerds with sleep issues. And if you want to fuel the next story, drop a tip over at ko-fi.com/Napmax. It keeps the lights dim and the storytelling honest. Until next time, sleep deep, question tradition, and maybe don't eat anything prescribed by a medieval doctor. This was Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've just listened to the craziest customs from the Middle Ages. You won't believe they were real.